Good morning, good evening, good day, greetings, and a helping side of salutations with some extra welcome on the side of the Safe Room featuring Security Side Quest. My name is Tristan Watty, and thank you for joining me today as we continue our great and epic security adventures. If this is your first time, thank you for joining in. Feel free to say hello, just like our great producer Jeff does. Thank you, producer Jeff, for producing. But again, if this is your first time, let me take this step back to reintroduce myself. My name is Tristan Watty. I come to you from the Professional Services Division of AWS, where we help to accelerate customers' journeys to the cloud in a secure manner, fashion, form, and way. And usually I am joined by my counterpart on the CERT team. But today, it's an interesting one because the topic, little tidbits, is into chaos engineering. And the chaos engineering might stem, I should say, from just one person. So why don't we go alone and see what happens in this episode? But I also have chat with me. So Victor, always great to see you. I am doing fine. Thank you for asking. I want to know how you are doing today, right? And yes, no Russ today. Yes, we're greatly saddened, and I have to take extra sips of coffee to keep up said energy. But feel free, chat, to keep me up by putting in some tidbits, and also just chime in to say, hello, or where you're tuning in from, as well as I'll take the dramatic pause for this because it's always a great one. We always have these questions that we like to stem, but today's a simple one. Today is, what is your favorite candy? This is an oldie but a goodie because I like to see how people's candy tastes evolve over time. So feel free to put it in the chat while you're saying hello. And Ari says, what is my favorite coffee? It's funny. I'm a hazelnut oat milk type of person, for the basic. But I do like some extravagant kinds. But usually the hazelnut with oat milk gets it done for the day. And hello, SM. Thank you for joining in. So when it comes to candy, I'm also a classic type of person. I like peanut chews, right? Simple. You would never guess that. But it's one of those things that, every once in a while, it's just like, oh, where's a peanut chew at? I haven't had it in a while. But feel free to let me know, and feel free to add some chaos into your candy selection if I would like to trigger that for today's episode's title. But I always have to pull myself back because it's fun to speak about a number of different things. But one of those things that we want to speak about today, if we continue on our path of just overall, hey, we came from 10 billion events, one detection. Then we spoke about getting excited from detection signal to automated response. And today's title kind of goes to a little bit of a culmination of both of those items, where it's 10 billion% reliable, security chaos engineering. So we're essentially walking through the different pieces of this, where we started out saying, hey, how do we identify the threats? How do we detect the threats? Then how can we alarm and respond in an automated fashion? Now is, how can we test this out? Right? That's the key piece, because you can build in all these mechanisms into your overarching security posture. But one of the key pieces that we always have to consider is, hey, how do we test these things? And that's a key part, is making sure we have some type of testing plan. What is your scientific method? And how does it meet your incident response capabilities within your organization? I would say it's kind of a twofold item there, because essentially you want to design controlled chaos experiments on AWS. And what I mean by that is you want to set up environments, you want to set up schemes, you want to set up different, let's say, scientific method path and workflows in order to test. Because what you essentially want is something you can reproduce. You want that reproducible science, so that you can build a continuous validation practice throughout your organization, so that you get to the point where things are 10 billion% reliable, that you prove them resilient. And if you understand the 10 billion%, that's 10 billion points to you because that reference is an interesting one. And Ari points out that, oh, Ari likes peanut butter cups. That is a good choice. And Victor, network. So is network your favorite candy? So the piece we want to take a step back into and understand is, hey, what's stopping you from testing and treating instant response within your environment like a real experiment? Feel free to put it in the chat, because usually what we hear is, hey, we don't have a safe place to inject controlled failures. We can't reproduce attack scenarios on demand, or we have no telemetry so that we can measure the actual detection. That's some of the things you hear, and it kind of takes you back a couple of episodes. Right? So when it comes to the questionnaire, so would you create a test environment that's a clone of your production environment? So I would say the infrastructure that you provision, hopefully you're producing and using IAC or some other mechanism like that, and then taking the step back to say, not include any sensitive data, and make sure that, you're not copying any sensitive keys or anything along those lines from production. But essentially you want as close as production as you can get to with synthetic data and the mechanisms behind it. So thank you for that question. Because what we're trying to do is essentially get excited, right? Especially when it comes to finding out where the scientific method meets your incident response capabilities, right? So when we think about this, we want to think about, what is our hypothesis? What is the thing that we're trying to understand? Where's the why, right? And how can we kind of take it from there, right? The why, when it comes to a response, is, hey, we have to exercise this in such a way that it's not just an afterthought. It's built into the overarching method. So how would you, let's say, have systems manager runbooks or AWS Lambda remediations? You go through the process, right? So this is all pieces of the puzzle that you need to go through. And then we have a question. Deep Purple, how much are we trusting passkeys as we don't own the info behind it? If you could elaborate a little bit more on that, because if you are speaking more from, CMKs or HSMs that you can bring your own key material into and kind of going through there, that is one method, right? Because you have AWS managed keys and then you have CMKs. So there's a bunch of items that I would say also jump into having a conversation about the shared responsibility model and understanding where the customer starts and where AWS starts, right? Is of the cloud and in the cloud, and understanding the different components that go into those, right? And being able to adjust and modify your security workloads as you're migrating to the cloud to take advantage of some of the deep capabilities within the AWS platform itself. But one of the pieces, and we can jump into, is kind of the foundations of, let's say, chaos engineering as a whole. So how do we do so? Well, I think the best part or best place to start off with is, hey, let's look at what is some of the foundational. If we were to pull this up into somewhat of a website and say, hey, in this section, you will find controls and recommendations that make effort to implement quick wins. Well, security governs, right? So if we enhance, right, is one of the key pieces of this. It always starts with the identity, right? And then you kind of work on those different pieces because you want to implement those factors of least privilege into your organization, right? So how do you have least privilege? Well, you start out, who needs access to what? And Deep Purple says, I had two-factor on one phone. Losing it caused me so much head spin. So no reliability there. So that's one of the key aspects, right? There's multiple ways to go about it when it comes to multi-factor authentication to have some type of break glass role where you have the ability to have a role that is assumed specifically for break glass if you lose your two-factor authentication. The other side of that is to have more of a two turnkey approach, to have a third-party tool in order to manage your two-factor authentication, because what is your overall workflow in there, right? Because you can have IAM Identity Center, and then you can also have one of our partners in terms of just managing your credentials and things of that nature, especially from a sensitive standpoint, right? So there's a couple different ways there. So thanks for that question, Deep Purple. And Gus, good afternoon to you as well. And I think that goes right in line with what we were saying is security governance. How do we manage these different, especially from just exactly what we just said? It's a perfect question, Purple, where you're saying, hey, I had this problem and this is chaos for me, right? At least. But now we have to factor this into the methodology and approach that says, hey, what happens if something does happen within our environment? These are things that you start to map out and start to think about. Because as you go through your journey, especially from an identity standpoint, you want to make sure that you have the resiliency in place. And it may not just be one credentials, and you may have to implement other mechanisms in order to ensure that you have your resiliency. But it's all part of, hey, what's the scientific method behind it? Did you take that step back? And what is the hypothesis is, hey, if I lose my phone, what happens? Right? And going through that iteration and that process, because that's all part of this, right? And going through the appropriate routes and let's say guardrails that you have in your organization when it comes to these different items. And Victor, yes, I am. It's one of those things where I want to get a shirt that says identity. And then on the back of the shirt it says least privilege, right? Because that's where we're heading, right? With a lot of our conversations. The other part is making sure that we grant temporary, I say temporary, credentials. We do not want long-term standing credentials within our environment. We want to make sure we have the mechanisms that, hey, if we're assuming a role, it's a temporary role, that's getting temporary credentials and going from there. And you have the correct guardrails in place. For example, if you're authenticating, the usual use cases having something like Entra ID, and you have your security groups that connect into Identity Center assigns permission sets into those different security groups that have been carried over from Entra. And now you need to make sure that those permission sets have least privilege built into them from the start. Because one of the things that you see is, hey, we're just going to make the permission sets admin. But what happens over time is a sprawl. And this is where the testing and the rest of this list comes into play. Because as you start to go through this list, you say, okay, what is my data protection strategy? What is my application security? And if those foundational pieces aren't there, then how do you get towards that goal of 10 billion% reliable? It's an interesting question to ask. So when you want to start to go through this, hey, these are some fundamental items when you're thinking about your guardrails, your temporary credentials, your threat detection mechanisms. This is all parts of the puzzle that you need to put together, because then it goes back to what we were just speaking about, testing. How do you test this? How do you test your guardrail and your SCP policies? Well, one SCP is just, hey, can this user log in and perform an action? If it doesn't, within the console, you will see a bright red bar pop up that says you do not have access. And then it's like, okay, I tested that, but how do I test something like threat detection and all those other items? Because if I'm getting 10 billion alerts, well, how do I know one of those alerts isn't accounted for? What I mean by that is there's no trigger for it for my system. There's no run book or something along those lines. I may not have accounted for it. And that's where this part of chaos testing comes into place. And that's why you get excited, right? Because you're like, hey, I want to go through this route. I want to understand these different pieces of the puzzle so that when I get to the part of, okay, applying that scientific method of saying, forming a hypothesis, designing the experiment, run it under controlled conditions, and let telemetry take it from there. In AWS, you will have CloudWatch, and then you would have Security Hub, right? These are the type of things that you're looking for in order to piece it together. The other side of this is making sure that the metrics that you are forming, that you are calling out, let's say, frame your experiment. So do you have your mean time to contain, your mean time to respond within your CloudWatch metrics? Because you want to make sure that they're heading towards your North Star. And with your North Star with security, you want to make sure if you have your, let's say, your SLAs, your goals, your frameworks that you need to meet for your MTTC and your MTTR, that your CloudWatch metrics reflect that, and that you can take the appropriate steps to tune and tweak that. Same thing with Security Hub, and same thing with your CloudTrail events. Right? You want to make sure that you have the measures from detection to containment, especially if there's some type of latency in between. What I mean by latency is what are the different metrics in order to trigger said alarm. So if you have an alarm come in and it takes CloudTrail a certain amount of minutes, and then from guard duty it takes a certain amount of minutes, and then from your CloudWatch metrics it takes a certain amount of minutes. And that's where we started to go from understanding, hey, what are the automated mechanisms we can build into this so that when we have a possible threat, it's taken care of and maybe notifies that it was taken care of and it's automatically prevented and blocked ahead of time. Right? So you're taking the human aspect out of that piece, and then you're continuing to refine your environment over time. So you want to essentially shift from, hey, we think this works, to we've proven it works by validating with the certain services, the guard duties, detectives, security hubs, through our event-driven workflows, because they fired just as expected. Those are the pieces of the puzzle that you need to get to. And those are some of the foundational pieces of this. So when you think of the overall flow, if we go back to kind of a nice, let's say, chart, respond and learn, design and implement, evaluate and test, operate. And this is a reoccurring cycle that's going on. As it's occurring, you don't want to be inside of this wheel without a plan, right? Because what you're trying to do is get essentially to how you increase your overall resilience and improve your customer experience by using chaos engineering. And the way to improve that experience is to make sure that everything is known to your capabilities. So if you go through this process and say, hey, I need to validate the chain from end to end, how do I do so? Oh, it's laid out over here in this page. So when you start to go through and understand some of the chaos engineering capabilities within AWS and how the methodologies that you can, take in order to figure out, hey, this is the path forward for this. This is what we have to do for a continuous life cycle. So if we go through this, hey, define the objective, selecting the target application, mental maps. This is all part of that scientific method that we were mentioning. And you see how it kind of builds upon each other. All these different pieces get to the point of, hey, this is the path forward, right? So when you're looking to answer the questions to yourself, you want to take that next step of designing the controlled chaos experiments. So this means you're using a purpose-built, and I'll take the time back, further back, to say controlled is the key word. That means making sure that all of your individuals in your organization know when it's happening, how it's happening, your ticketing, your alarms, everything is controlled, right? And you want to make sure that the environment that you're testing it has things that have been provisioned in your normal policy and procedural automated way. That means your SCPs are the same. Make sure you have VPC isolation for the experiments. You never want to touch production. You want to make sure that you take that step back and say, okay, this is what we're going to do. This is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to execute upon it. But the other piece of this is what Gus mentioned. I see architecture from development companies that don't care about data in transit or rest. Even with shared responsibility, this is still complicated, especially now in the Gen AI. Whenever possible, we need to implement some kind of digital transformation with secrecy model in mind. And it's an important thing to kind of dissect and dive into, right? So if we take bits and pieces of this, so development companies don't care about data in transit at rest. This is a major item of having the conversation on why you should care about data in transit at rest. Because if you don't have data encrypted, if you don't have data at rest encrypted, right? It's just having databases that are open that are not encrypted, there's a potential for all of that data to leak. And to your point, this is important now, especially within the Gen AI era, as more data is consumed within different services and resources and things of that nature. You want to make sure, one, you understand what your data is. Do you have data classifications? Do you have tagging in place to say this is our sensitive data, this is our non-sensitive data, and this is our log data, right? That's encrypted. That's another piece of this. But when you dive into all of those areas, it's important to walk through those steps, right? Because this block of text is very important to understand. These are the different concerns that come up when we have conversations with customers, right? Is, hey, I am part of security department, or I'm a developer, and I see the development process, and it's, hey, we got to move fast. We got to move forward. But you want to make sure that security is your top priority, because taking the step back and looking at the trajectory means you're opening yourself up to more and more risk as you go forward. You want to make sure that you have baselines in place. So as you're mentioning doing chaos engineering, the steps within chaos engineering is kind of what we laid out with, hey, making sure that you have the foundational pieces understood, because they're important, right? Making sure that you have the guardrails, making sure that you have the monitoring, all those configurations, right? Because when it's not there, it's exactly as Gus was mentioning, where you have the potential risks open within your environment that you need to go through. So go through and understand. Victor, really, I never prefer third-party secure container because the license maybe can be implemented after on-demand only so. So I think part of this, Victor, is understanding, one, also licensing plays one of the parts, right? Especially from a compliance and regulatory standpoint, just making sure you understand your licensing, especially if you're doing migrations. But I think that goes back to our earlier point as well, is just making sure that we understand all the different pieces of the puzzle and how they connect together. So parts of this, if we were to run our experiment, if we didn't have these pieces in play, how would we go about this? Because just to go through an experiment, to test that something is working, you have to understand the fundamentals and the foundations. And you want to go to make sure that, hey, if I want to have and leverage AWS fault injection service, okay, I want to simulate an IAM credential abuse or an EC2 compromise or resource failures or something along those lines, those built-in conditions with CloudTrail or CloudWatch, I should say. These are all pieces of the puzzle that you have to consider. The other side of this is exactly where we're going to with our overarching process of breaking it down a little bit further. Because when you start to understand, when you define the objective and select the target, these are very specific tasks that you want to break these into. You don't want to keep it broad of like, hey, we're going to test all our controls. It's like, well, you need to, what is your hypothesis that you're walking into? What are you defining within said hypothesis? It's, hey, I believe as an end user, I cannot access EC2 creation within the console. Okay. So my hypothesis is I shouldn't be able to do this. And then you go through and test your hypothesis. And if you are, then it goes back to the drawing board of like, hey, I validated my response, and you know what? We need some more tweaks. We need a little bit more tuning on the different items because it's important to understand these different pieces. The other side of this is scale, because without the different pieces of the puzzle, we can't get to the part where, hey, we want to identify potential failures or weaknesses in our systems and our services, right? Part of scaling is taking this step by step. So this first paragraph becomes important, right? Because this includes everything that, possible failures can do. And this is defined within your overarching plan, especially from a chaos engineering standpoint. Because if you want to verify that you're scalable, you want to make sure that the building blocks are there along the way. So how do you get to the point that you can verify cross-account response via event bridge? That's an interesting thing. It's an interesting concept. One that I would say dive into the console, play around. Or you could just simply, look at some examples and go on a couple of side quests and hear about some legends of, I would say, I almost forgot my old English for a second. So how do we dive into that? Well, we jump into our segment where we turn on our favorite music and dive right in, because this segment of our show is called As Side Quest Legend Has It. I would do the voice, but it's been a long weekend and I don't have enough coffee. So this section of our show is where we dive into customer stories and analogies, where we essentially speak about some different scenarios, fictitiously. So the way we communicate these is through our side quest board. And our side quest board is our visual representation of what we're doing today. So feel free to put into the chat any questions you may have as we speak through today's scenario. So today we have our company, right? Let us call this company, I don't know, meantime detections, right? So meantime detections, let's say they have a meantime to detect philosophy. So they want to make sure that their targets are under certain variables. Let's say 60 seconds for credential-based attacks or 5 minutes for workload compromises. We are meantime to detect. So how do we take care of that? Well, we start out by looking at our environment. As always, we have our AWS environment and our S3 bucket, our authenticated user and our unauthenticated users. So what if we start out our scenario diving in to the part where we have unauthenticated users trying to access our account? Well, meantime to detect. Let's say they have state-of-the-art detection, right? That's what's in the marketing material. They go through, they have 89 academic centers. They have 31 petabytes of data within multiple buckets. They have to be HIPAA and GDPR and everything certified. Well, how does this play out in this scenario? Because maybe a different type of threat emerged. Let's say something like a ransomware attack occurred within the organization. Now it took, let's say, 5 months to understand that it was an exfiltration attempt. Now the CISO is having the conversations with their different stakeholders. They ask, hey, what was tested? How were these rules tested? We have the different services set up. And that's when usually the SOC falls silent. So we dive into our story of how was the gap exposed? Well, the gap was exposed just by, one, understanding, hey, this has been sitting in the environment, going through the CloudTrail logs, going through CloudWatch, looking at metrics. and they see that the detections were fired, but let's say the council, because I always like to use the council, it sounds great, right, is diving into saying, hey, there was no automated containment workflow. So for the credential exfiltration, now the detections themselves started to build upon each other. What that means is things were not, let's say, recognized appropriately, and the response actions to those different pieces weren't uniform, and there was no custom, let's say, examples that were made. Different things, right? Different items that all come together in a certain way, just for a simple item like this. And no, Crate, it's not about a specific event. This is a fictitious event, right? Because they all have the undercover theme of, hey, something was detected, but it wasn't acted upon. So how do we, let's say, back up our scenario? So if we were to move over our unauthenticated users, now we have to add some different items in between. So usually we would have something simple like, hey, we have a WAF protecting our applications. We have one on our CloudFront distros, all those kind of things, right? But these are the questions that we start to ask. But usually what we like to start off with is, what are the basics in place? What are the different components that need to be put down face up? Like Security Hub, right? I would say that's one of the different components that is key to our story. Because do we have, let's say, custom triggers within Security Hub? That's one way that they could improve upon their situation. Another way is, hey, we have all these CloudTrail logs that are just capturing information, right? They're saying, what are the ins and outs of the API actions that are being taken? And now we have to figure out something needs to consume those. And usually that's where, if we put guard duty right on top of the CloudTrail logs, now we have these mechanisms that are saying, hey, this is a finding. This is something out of the usual, using the machine learning process within guard duty, right? To say, hey, these API calls, this is subject to this. And we can do a couple things with this. We can feed it into Security Hub and then act upon it. But how do we act upon it is the question. And dramatic pause as we say, I think the best way to do this is through automation and using, somewhat of a step function, right? We just have a step function over here. We move our authenticated user, and let's move this a little bit closer and say, all right, we have some automation. What is our automation going to do? It's a good question. These are the questions that you start to ask and go back to our hypothesis. We had an incident occur. We're trying to understand the life cycle of what we're trying to deal with, because imagine we contained this. We figured out what happened, but how do we prevent this from occurring again? Well, you dive deep into understanding the overarching process, right? So you want to make sure, hey, what are the different pieces of the puzzle? And the different pieces of the puzzle are actively understanding what are the different feeds, what are the different triggers that we have available. To your point, how do we feed it into Security Hub? Isn't that easier said than done? No. So this is what's great, is if we take the pause from our story, you can have something like Control Tower, and then you can have your AWS organizations, all your accounts, and then you can have these different security services enabled, where you have guard duty, you have Security Hub, you have AWS config. And then with this, you have your holistic strategy. And it's a lot easier to implement that way. Right? So thank you, great, for that. So feeding all these different pieces, you can even export, I would say, from Security Hub into, let's say, a S3 bucket or into a data lake, and then take that and do some, let's say, modifications to it before it gets to your SIM and for optimization. But I digress. Chaos engineering. Thank you for that question, because the key piece of this is there's different parts and different steps along the way. We are speaking about our step function, for example, of what is our triggers that are occurring. So I think part of the conversation is our metrics, our different guard duty loads. What we want is the different pieces of logic. As things occur, we want something to trigger. And that's where we hit the good old pause game, Zach Morris timeout, as I call it, and take that step back, right? A little bit further back. Because what we want to do is understand that, hey, the music, sometimes stops and becomes a little bit more reflective, a little bit of a different tone. It's sadder because you're in the cycle of understanding that there was a gap within your environment. But it doesn't have to be like that, because the thing about chaos engineering is you took all these steps to put controls, and it's here to help you continue to build upon those controls that you developed, right? By testing in a isolated experimental environment. I keep saying that 3 times for the people on the other side, as well as I say, hello, Vincent, thank you for joining in. So the thing that you have to go about and kind of dive into is making sure you have the reproducible pieces of the puzzle, right? You want to make sure that, hey, do you do items of building a continuously validated practice? So, and Andre says, so we've reconfigured all the services, defined instant response times, and action runbooks. Ideally, by the way, do we have some kind of action runbooks library in AWS? But how to test this? Well, within GitHub, there's a bunch of different baselines that you can use just from a variety of different perspectives. So I would check the AWS samples section. That usually has a bunch of different foundational pieces that you can leverage. The piece that you want to go to with testing is what we're outlining in this episode of, hey, what are your foundational pieces to start off with? Because as you mentioned, you're like, hey, we reconfigure all the services and define incident response. What are the different mechanisms that you defined within your reconfiguration? Because you had a North Star when you reconfigured these. What were they? Were they to meet your mean time to contain or your mean time to respond? Were they centralizing items? Were they, putting into place additional alerts? Were they sending items to a SIM? Right? These are all pieces of the puzzle when it comes to defining your runbooks. And your runbooks can also be created from doing tabletop exercise. That's another piece of the puzzle of, hey, let's run an exercise and see how far our responders gets, our SOC gets, our NOC gets when it comes to a simulated environment. But the chaos engineering piece is, hey, we're testing specific actions to make sure that they are reproducible. Thank you, Andre, for that question. Part of this is, hey, maybe you can leverage experiments. Let's say if you use FIS experiments into CI/CD using AWS code pipeline with code build, right? Just as a methodology, right? So you're using the fault injection service. Now you can start to say, here, there's a validation stage, defining everything as code with event break rules, and so on and so forth. These are all pieces of the puzzle, because now, once you define it as IAC, these are repeatable items, and you can turn these into game days, which are actually pretty fun, right? Because you go through the steps and say, hey, we can modify this. And codify equals being able to reproduce the attack scenarios. And then you can also version control and things of that nature. But the overarching part of what we're trying to get to is understanding, what are your challenges with implementing the chaos engineering and the approach to it? And also, what is the different capabilities in order to handle this, right? Because when you think of, let's say, a multi-account environment, this is another part of the puzzle of saying, hey, I need to account for my biggest challenge with multi-account response in AWS organizations. Now we're starting to get to the point where, hey, is our biggest challenge aggregating our findings in Security Hub and delegating administration to the earlier point? Do we have consistent IAM roles? Do we have centralized versus distributed? SCPs accidentally block your remediation access? All pieces of the puzzle. So I think part of this needs to be centered around how we fine-tune and understand what is our biggest challenges. And great, we use the new security agent to assess AWS security. Say we do not have any app code, but we're just running AWS services, Control Tower, Amazon Workspace, etc. This is an interesting concept, right? Where you can have some specs created in order to test out kind of the underlying, hey, if we were to codify this, or if we didn't codify this, where the potential vulnerabilities are, where do we head within our organization posture. But the key step of this is, while you can map out the specs, the other piece is you still want to have the testing period of having the isolated environment and running through these different components, right? Because if you have, let's say, control tower within your environment with workspaces, one piece of a control tower set up and the AWS organizational design based on something like the SRA, the security reference architecture, is having an experimental OU. And within that experimental OU is exactly kind of the mindset that you get into, right? Where you have the different guardrails and things of that nature. So you can experiment, right? Essentially with these different pieces. So thank you for that question as well. These are all good, great conversation pieces because we're trying to head towards that 10 billion% reliability. Again, 10 billion points for you if you get these references. So if you want to drive down something like dwell time, how do you do it? Well, you want to translate validated automation into faster containment. And to the earlier point of create is if you don't have the codification within your environment, these are all pieces of the puzzle that start to add up because now you have to have the other mechanisms in place, right? Are you using CloudWatch metrics and step functions to execute, let's say, a measure that you can help, one, measure, but also, two, reduce the dwell time and improve your MTTR, right? These are all pieces of the puzzle that you're trying to get to and trying to solve. So the best approach for this, if you're going down the path of experimenting, is to try and codify all these different items. Whether you're using CloudFormation, CDK, or Terraform, something along those lines, right? You want to make sure that you're heading down the path of IAC, especially now with tools like the security agent, DevOps, and so on and so forth. So when you go down the understanding of how do we make this more reliable, it's an interesting question. Because if we keep going back to that part in this episode, we touch upon it a couple different times of the way we understand this is to ask specific questions and make a hypothesis and kind of work backwards from that. So one place you can start with from trying to formulate the hypothesis, because that's usually the question. It's like, well, I don't know what questions to ask if I don't know what questions to ask. So one way to go about this is to dive in and just read some of the different certificates that are out there, right? Your different specialties, understanding AWS environment, so on and so forth. But the other piece is to go on some, I would say, knowledge quests, which is the segment in our show where we dive into understanding, right? What pieces of documentation, information after we, wake up, take our 5 a.m. run, grab the beverage of our choice and say, hey, I want to dive into understanding security agent or all these different pieces of the AWS environment and security capabilities. Well, that's what Knowledge Quest is here for, as well as it just kind of helps you build aura as well, right, as you're going along, because there's the constant need to grow and advance your environment. And the constant need to go from, let's say, L100 up, where if we were to take a certain reference to a certain, let's say, franchise, you start out as, if you're in the Stone Age, a village apprentice. Right? If we were to correlate this, where, hey, I'm trying to build up my organization, my town, my civilization. How do I do this? How do I go from L100? Especially when it comes to chaos engineering and testing out these different features. Well, what are the tools that we have? That's an important part. So the first tool I would say dive into and understand is coming to, hey, what's the FIS, fault injection service? I mentioned it a couple of times. So essentially, with this, it can help you run controlled chaos experiments that inject real faults and attack conditions into your AWS environment. So you can also have stop conditions, because you don't want to make sure, you want to make sure that you don't, just have something open-ended that can affect your test. And you want to make sure that there's controls, especially if you're building out in your isolated place. And part of this is diving into the service. This is where the L100, this is where your apprentice trying to figure out, okay, these are the tools. These are how we plan to use them, so that we can get into understanding, right, if we have some type of orchestration, what goes into that orchestration workflow? How can we leverage something like, Security Hub, CSPM, with our organizational structure? How can we understand what prescriptive guidance is, right? What is the known patterns of good? Because when you start to dive into this, especially with everything we were just going through, of taking everything one step at a time, well, the introductional piece is an important part of the puzzle. Because if you're trying to level up one piece at a time, parting that level 100 is just introducing the different tools. But the other piece of this is how to ensure that you have the continuous approach to continue to build. Because if you don't have the continuous approach, then you start to get to the point of, all right, what do we have to do again? Where do we have to go? And that's where the questions come from, and that's where the potential gaps come from, because you don't know what questions to ask, because, hey, I'm an L100. But when you start to figure out, hey, the real question is to ask is, what hypothesis do we have to create within our environment to carry forward? And that's where we start to level up a little bit. This is how we get to be an engineer of science engineer, right? Quality update. I would say this is a knowledge update, right? Because if we were to create a role to schedule something like the FIS test, now you start to get into running your experiments, not just once, but a reoccurring fashion, manner, and form, right? Where you can create experiments, you can start to map out those conditions in the long way, right? These are all pieces of the puzzle of, hey, how do I proceed forward? How do I know to build out step functions a certain way that says when A and B happens within the organization, I know to take steps D, E, F, right? With automation top of mind, so that we get some automated responses. And I like to pull up, articles from past, because it just shows you foundational pieces still apply, right? So automation response for AWS Security Hub. So this is back in 2020. So going through and understanding, hey, what the Security Hub service was 6 years ago to now. Because usually what happens is, hey, this different piece right here, right? So if we say this was 2020 and we're speaking about automation and the architecture way back when of how to automate these different pieces, sometimes what happens in organizations is, hey, this is working, so just have it continue to work. And to Ken's point is, why break it if it ain't broke? Right? And the thing is, it might already be broken. It just hasn't had the right hypothesis run against it, right? That could be one of those things. It's like, hey, this control tower has been running for the last 4 years. Well, did you update control tower? Well, our AFT has been running. Have you updated it and patched? There's been, different increments. I would say incremental updates to all these services to integrate a different way, to fit together, to provide more visibility, right? Could be simple of, hey, organizational trails are handled like this now, right? These are all pieces of the puzzle, because if you're creating something like event bridge rules and event bridge patterns, that's all pieces of the science engineering piece that you're trying to, I wouldn't say reverse engineer, but strictly come to a conclusion of, hey, I know how this is supposed to trigger. Now I need to create a workflow to trigger it. And you can do systems manager, incident response, disable, permission for a temporary security credential. This is all part of that science engineering piece. This is how you start to, have the heartbeat, the rhythm return, the quick, fast of, okay, I'm going to press the button. I don't know what's going to happen, right? To more of like, okay, this is what's going to occur. And walking through, picture this, if you take that step back, right? You're a science engineer, right? You understand, you have your chaos engineering tested. You know your environment. So when something happens, you say, hey, in 15 minutes, this alert is going to trigger. And it does trigger. You know what that means? Applause, claps, different stakeholders in a room, because you understand the environment. You understand how everything's going to trigger, how everything's going to work in a certain way. And then eventually, over time, you become a little bit more of a 10 billion% tier detection architect. You know why? Because you took the time to build the foundations of the L100, the 200. And now you start to think about, okay, understand all the fundamentals. I understand what everything's supposed to look like from a fundamentals level. And then, now, what's left? Well, the piece that is left is understanding, how can we scale? Because now you start to get into, I understand the fundamental items. I understand the basics. Now I want to make sure that as an organization, I have a way to scale my different game days, chain different experiments together, and understand overarchingly, hey, I want to have response code. And by response code, I mean, hey, can we automate these different pieces using the different tools, using everything we were just speaking about, but making sure that we have key aspects, like maybe the security reference architecture, for example, in place. That's a key part of it. And feel free to put comments. How often do you go into and read the security reference architecture? Is it when you're building? Is it to check for updates when you have questions on services? Or is it just part of your normal routine and your compliance standards to say, hey, we're going to go through this amount of times per year in order to update our documentation internally, to update what we think of our hypothesis at that moment in time and how we can evolve it, right? Because if you look at the architecture, one of the key parts of this is, hey, what is the AI ML security within my environment? Do we have the capabilities? Do we understand how we have provable security methodologies, right? Do we have the automated tools that can develop things with, let's say, a growing organization that is scalable in mind? That's usually the key concept, the scalable. Because it's easy to protect one account, 2 accounts, 3 accounts. But what happens when you have 100? What type of alerts, what type of metrics are you gathering? And how do you stop everything from overwhelming your organization? That's where you take the dramatic pause. take a sip of your coffee and say, hey, well, I have an idea. Let's try out chaos engineering. We have the tools. We have the knowledge. We listen to the Safe Room Feature and Security Side Quest every Monday, 2 p.m. Eastern, in order to figure out what to do next. But a key piece of this, and I would say the takeaways for this, is go through the SRA. Just figure out, hey, I have all this tooling. I have all these capabilities. Now do I know how to apply this so that I can be a 10 billion% tier architect, right? The other piece is, hey, how can you understand the different pieces of it? So one of the things Ken says, I never understood the part of the game day to break things. I've deployed many services, they stay up. So it's an interesting thing. And part of it is, it's not the breaking part as much as is the understanding and testing your hypothesis. So what we were doing is understanding, how do we think about our environment? Then how can we create a hypothesis that we can test our controls? So it's more of testing our controls, testing our theories, and making sure that we have the different outcomes be expected, even though they vary. So that's kind of where we're coming from. And this is the interesting mindset, because now if you're going through this process of just taking that step back and creating a hypothesis, it could be simple as saying, hey, this should be blocked. And if it's not blocked, why wasn't it? And that's how you start to build up your chaos engineering, muscle. 1 XP point at a time, and overall, 1 level at a time. Because when you level up from that 1 XP, you don't just level up yourself. You level up your organization and the security controls that go around it. So continue to figure out what brings you joy. Thank you, Zero, for that. And also what you can feel confident about 10 billion% when it comes to detecting, when it comes to automation, when it comes to understanding your overarching incident response capabilities. And feel free to, dive in a little bit deeper into all the articles, the security reference, everything we mentioned. But there's one thing we like to mention at the end of every episode is building an incident response plan. I channel my inner Russ when I say that, because the incident response plan will help you to figure out, hey, how we're going to respond to these different items. And you know what that spawns off? Questions that turn into hypothesis that eventually turn into solutions and outcomes. And feel free to let me know on the next episode, next week, as we continue to dive into a little bit more of incident response. And until next time, I would say take care, have fun, make a little bit of chaos out there in a secure manner, fashion, form, and way. So until next time, have a great one. Have fun.